Thank you so much for joining me today to discuss what I think is a really, really important issue. I know it's a really crazy time of year, but this announcement from the New Zealand government this week about their commitment, they're following through with their commitment to protect women's sport in New Zealand is really critical. And I also really wanted to discuss with you the response from the mainstream New Zealand media, which wasn't particularly positive. So just before we get into it, I just want to do a really quick summary of you and your accomplishments, just for anyone who isn't aware of you. So obviously you're someone who has competed in track events and marathons. You are an Olympic medalist, a Commonwealth Games medalist. You've won multiple marathons, including the Boston Marathon, and you are known as one of New Zealand's greatest female distance runners, which they're all huge accomplishments. So it's incredible to have someone like you to come and talk about this issue with us. And obviously, as someone who competed in female sports over the decades, there would have been issues that you would have faced as a female athlete, I imagine, in relation to things like, fairness and equality and all of that. And so I thought I'd just get you to start with just talking to me a little bit about the kinds of issues that you faced as a female athlete.
Well, in my day, there was an issue with inclusion, and the inclusion was to have females included and have the parity of events that men had. So this issue of exclusion from sports was a very real issue for female athletes in my time. At the age of 13, I shone as a distance runner. I was not a fast sprinter, but once I got into the longer distances, so anything that was longer than 100 meters, I immediately showed that I had some sort of aptitude for it. And yet, at that time, when we're talking about the world stage, the parity of events for women just wasn't there. So at Olympic level, which really sets a standard and is the highest stage that an athlete can aspire to, the longest event in the Olympics for women up to 1972 was the 1,500 meters, which is less than a mile.
Wow, and it was different for men though at that time.
Yes, so the men had the 1,500 meters, the 3,000 steeplechase, the 5,000, the 10,000 and the marathon. But those longer events were considered too brutal, too taxing, but also that the women were considered the secondary event. It was just sort of to placate those few odd women that wanted to compete in sports, because, sports was really a man's world, and it was not considered a feminine thing to do. And yet I lived in this country that has this incredible sporting history and the whole national psyche organized around sports, from a very active family, great outdoors, those wonderful times that we old people like talk about in New Zealand growing up, bare feet, running over fields, and very, very active. And so I had a calling to the sports and engaged in it because I had brothers and I did what they did, etc. But it soon became apparent to me once I was in high school and I was running in national championships from the age of 14 on. And I was running in senior women's events. So I was running against women who are a lot older than me. And that was simply because there weren't junior women's events. It was just starting that they were having school events. So they had a North Island school championship. I don't know. I don't think they had a South because it was too small, probably not enough numbers. But, it was just sort of beginning. And the world was in this sort of rapid sort of change, and our societies were undergoing a lot of evolutionary developments. And so at the age of 14, I was running in sports, and I was running in the 800, 400 meters, 800 meters. Actually, they were yards in those times, 440 yards, 880 yards, the 1500, because that was all that was available. In the winter, we did cross country. The cross country events at World Championship level, there was an unofficial World Championship for women. The men's was a very established type of competition. So that was also starting to change. And by the time I was 16, I was on my first national team and going overseas. And, you know, that was like, oh, this is the life for me. You know, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an athlete. And but there was nothing in the lexicon of teenage girl that would describe a career as a professional athlete.
Right. Okay.
The sports was not professional, and you know, I had to decide what to do when I left high school, and I went to university at Otago and did physical education because that was the closest thing to being that a sporty girl could do, you know. So I became a physical education teacher and did that for 2 years. And yet I had this calling always to go further afield. And in 1979, I was on a team for the World Cross Country Championships, and I had met a marathon runner in New Zealand, an American, and he had invited me to come and stay with him in the US, in Minneapolis. And so I ran the World Cross Country, and then got a ticket and detoured through the US and went and visited with him. So my foray into this road running, etc., was really because I was chasing a romance, and that's how it often happens for a lot of us. And so I started running these road races, and I ran my first 5K race. I ran my first 10K race. I ran a 10-mile race. I ran a 20-mile race. And then one weekend, everyone was going to this marathon in Duluth, Minnesota. And rather than be left out, I went along with them, though I had no interest in running a marathon. But I ran it as a training run, and I won the race.
Wow.
In the women's division. There weren't very many women, but it gave me a world ranked time. And I'll tell you, it wasn't that hard to get a world ranked time because there were not a lot of women running marathons. But it so happened that this woman, Catherine Switzer, and Catherine is married to Roger Robinson and lives in Wellington for most of the year. So Catherine was of fame of having entered the Boston Marathon under her initials. And so they gave her a number to run in the Boston Marathon. I think this was the 1967 Boston Marathon. And during the race director was on the press truck, and this big press truck was going, you know, passing through the field, and he saw a woman in his race, and he was absolutely outraged. Got them to stop the press truck and tried to rip her number off and throw her out of the race.
Oh my gosh.
So, and of course, the press truck, you know, click, 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 you know, they filmed the whole thing and it became front page news. And it was really one of those events that put this whole issue of should women be running, should women be doing this manly thing. And so it became an issue that had come to the forefront because of this. But it underscored the very reductive type of rules under which women were allowed to compete in this world. So, you know, largely excluded, to the extent that, you know, the race director was actually angry enough to try to throw a woman out of his race. And she was disqualified for breaking the rules. She'd run, it was against the rules for her to run with men, excuse me. to run with men, to run without a chaperone, to run further than the allowable distance for women, etc.
That's just incredible. I think a lot of people
Yeah,
in my generation would not even realize how bad it was in that regard. Like that people would just be outraged at the fact that women were, that women were running. It's just insane.
so, when we come to this whole trans thing about men who biological men feeling they have the right to include themselves in women's events, they don't realize the history and what we went through to secure for ourselves the events and the parity in sports and the opportunities to be able to compete. Now, the marathon was added in the 1984 Olympics for the first time. And that was a keystone moment for women. And I got to compete in that. And that started my career. That took me to 4 Olympics. I had the thrill of running marathons all over the world. And I finally realized my goal of standing on the Olympic podium. I hope to be in the gold medal on the top tier, but I got my bronze medal and I got to do da-da on the Olympic podium, which was my dream, to stand there. And I used to practice like, okay, here I am, and visualize myself on the Olympic podium. And it took me a long, long time to get there.
A lot of people would have that dream, a lot of athletes, but only very few actually make it. So that's just, it's amazing.
Yes. And the journey of being an athlete and the value of having to come back over and over and over again and refining your skill and getting the body, mind, the heart connection and the alignment that it takes to have that true peak performance on the day that counts is so valuable. And I can say that what I got in the sport, I very fairly earned. That was it was mine. It was my victory, and it happens on many levels. And it is a pathway, a journey that I would consider in many ways a journey of self-transformation, getting to know yourself in a true hero's journey, Joseph Campbell type way, that sport has that the physical excellence and the engagement of the body in striving for the very best that you can be is so valuable. And I think that plays a very, very important part in our society and our culture that we aspire to. And New Zealand has embraced that very much. We have many, many great sporting heroes, and we hold up our sporting tradition as something that is really valuable and key for people to aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, New Zealand obviously has a huge sporting tradition. We're a sporting nation over in New Zealand. I'm in New Zealand at the moment visiting family, so I can say over here. And we also, though, have a huge history of women's rights and women's empowerment. We were the first country to give women the vote. And so sport has obviously come a long way for women over the years, and you've obviously experienced that yourself and you've seen that. Did you ever think there would come a stage where you would be having to defend women's sport against biological males who identify as women wanting to compete in sporting events?
Oh, no, it never occurred to me, honestly. I thought when I retired in 1996 that I could be proud of how far we had come and the inroads that we had made and how much more opportunity there was for women and as a career, as a professional athlete, and the recognition of that wasn't available when I started. And so I really felt very proud of being a part of that. So, this backdoor thing of suddenly men coming through and competing in women's events. And I go, whoa, what just happened? I was absolutely astounded at that.
Yeah, doing so
And
well, and then there's just sort of a 180.
yeah. And the double speak, I think there's a real hypocrisy about it. I think it's absolutely unfair. And the bullying that goes with people who dare to speak their mind, yet I know the majority of people agree with me.
Yeah,
So
I completely agree. I think that's exactly right. The ordinary person, when they understand what's going on, is like, whoa, that doesn't make any sense at all. That's if they get the opportunity to understand what's going on, because obviously the media is very captured in a lot of different places all over the world, so they don't often get the full story. But when you actually talk to someone one-on-one and they realize that there are actually biological males competing against women, sometimes in contact sports, which obviously makes it very dangerous as well as unfair, people are just absolutely shocked.
well, Rachel, if you consider, like me, if men had been able to compete against in our category, I wouldn't have made an Olympics. Women cannot compete fairly against men. And I hear this argument, and that, there's an overlap between males and females, therefore men and women should compete together. But there's a very good reason why we have a female category in the first place.
Exactly.
If we followed that reasoning, we might as well just have it open sport. And then we're right back to where we are, and women would not be on the podium at all.
That's exactly right. And you've been quite vocal about this issue affecting women's sport over the last little while. Have you received much backlash for that?
No.
Okay,
No,
that's great. I'm
I
glad to hear that.
haven't. Maybe I'm a little insulated because I'm not living in New Zealand. So it probably makes it easier for me, but I really don't care, I think it's important for us to speak up on issues that society or the things that we see, and now that I am, I suppose, a bit of an elder, that I consider it's my moral duty to pass on the best that we have to people, and to call people out on this stuff that is really damaging. And Rachel, I'll tell you what I see as the most damaging part is that we now have a sitting problem. Sitting is the new smoking. Diabetes, obesity, all those kinds of things just shooting through the roof. And one of the groups that is biggest affected is teenage girls who at puberty, about 50% are going to give up doing sport altogether. Now, New Zealand has been very good at instigating programs to get a young woman moving and into a sport, even as just a recreational sport, but just as a general health and fitness. It's very important. And the ones who are generally affected are Maori women. And that age where women go through, there's a very different trajectory at puberty for men and for women. And that's because the biology kicks in. And I remember being on stage with New Zealand's greatest athlete, Peter Snell, and Peter was talking about his progression as an athlete. And at age 14, my 800-meter time was actually faster than Peter's.
Wow.
At age 14. And Peter turned to me and he said, well, Lorraine, you can see what testosterone does for you. Right.
That's right. Case in point.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the curve that I was on was very different from the curve that he was on, because, testosterone is given to the male. And it's a biological program that makes them stronger, faster, and able to be a protector and a hunter and all those kinds of things. So nature has provided for men in a different way than how they've provided for women. And those are very, very powerful biological programs that are laid down, and why we need to honor nature and live in harmony with nature with our social programs. And it's ludicrous for this gender fluidity. Why can't we just honor what we are? I have no problems with somebody expressing themselves the way they want to, but I do have a problem when somebody who is a male wants to call themselves a female and compete in women's sports, where to me it's akin to, let's have a 20-year-old compete against a 10-year-old. And we'd say, well, that's absolutely unfair. But we have to make these divisions and put people in a group. And then within that group, you work it out. Some people are going to do really well and have an aptitude to it and rise at the top, and other people are going to have a different role to play in it. And that's all great. You know, I wouldn't have been able to come win a race unless there were all those people behind me. You know, that's just the way it is. But, you know, when somebody wants to compete in a different category because they obviously can reap rewards that they couldn't reap if they went in the category that they were born in. And to me, that's very, very poor sportsmanship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so it goes against the grain of the whole idea of sport. You learn sportsmanship. You know, that was one of the first things that I was taught, was when I ran a race, if I got beaten or whoever won, I had to go up, no matter how I felt about it, and congratulate the other person. That was very, very much a part of our culture. And, you know, we never wanted to be accused of being a bad sport. But, you know, like I see these bad sports just running slipshod and calling that they're being bullied.
And getting celebrated for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, well, one more thing, Rachel, is these words inclusion are used in such a way that it's quite insidious, because when we have, say, our Minister of Sport saying that inclusion is the bottom line, and that at the grassroots level, we are promoting inclusion and fairness, the truth is that sport has always been inclusive. It's just you're not necessarily included in the category of your choice.
Exactly.
So it's used in a way that I think misleads the majority of people, because when you use those words, immediately you think, oh yes, inclusion is a really good thing. Oh yes, fairness is a really good thing. Therefore, I agree that we should include transgender people. Transgender people have always been included.
Yeah. In the appropriate sex category. That's exactly right. Yeah. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit more with you when we look at some of the claims that have been made in the media around this sort of recent announcement. But I couldn't agree with you more. Sport is available for everyone as long as you're in the category that's appropriate for you. It's like, you know, I couldn't go and compete with 10-year-old girls in whatever sport I choose because I'm not the right age. And there's, you know, similar things go for sex and weight and etc. So yeah, if you don't mind, well, that was a really fascinating background. I'm really glad that you were able to share that with us. I think it gives really good context to the conversation that we're going to have around this week's announcement regarding New Zealand Firsts and Nationals Coalition Agreement and their commitment to following through with their decision to protect female sport. So as someone who was raised in New Zealand, I was really excited to see some of the common sense commitments in the coalition agreement between New Zealand First and National, several of which pushed back quite strongly against gender ideology, which has really quite honestly captured New Zealand in a way that is a lot more ingrained than other parts of the world. And so to see this pushback was really, really encouraging. And one of the things that they decided to do was to protect female-only sport. And myself, other women's advocates all around the world were really excited about this. You know, this is something that's in line with international developments. And what was quite significant about it is that up until this point, it's predominantly been national and international sporting organisations that have been the ones to stand up for women's single-sex sport and to protect the female category. And this, however, is the New Zealand government actually saying, no, we're going to be the ones who are going to actually tackle this issue head on. And I think that's really, really good of them to do so. And we're trying to get the Australian government to do the same at the moment as well, but it hasn't budged yet. So the Kiwis are actually ahead of the Aussies on this one, which makes a nice change. And the other reason it's significant is that until this point, there's been a big focus on protecting elite female sport, but not as much focus on the community level. And so this policy, I understand, impacts all kinds of sport from the community level up. And that's something that those who don't approve of the policy are also particularly up in arms about. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well. So I understand that before the election, when the parties were talking about their different policies, their different perspectives on issues, you publicly said that you were throwing your support behind New Zealand First because of their policy around protecting female-only sport. Why did you decide to do that?
Because I love my country and I love sport, and it's been my life. And I thought that maybe, and I didn't see other athletes speaking up. And I thought, you know, I have to say something, and that it's important. Because I would hate to see this trend continue, because if it does, we're going to start to get crowded out with more and more men competing in women's categories. And next thing, women are right back where they were. And because, you know, Rachel, we don't see it going the other way.
No,
we only see it coming down, because, you know, the rewards are in your place, you know, and where you finish. When I was watching the Commonwealth Games with Laurel Hubbard in the weightlifting, in the women's weightlifting, and, you know, we're watching it, and the comments around the room were really, it was sort of everybody felt it wasn't right. And I'm sure that went in a lot of households, like to see a man competing against the women. And
I think those visuals in particular, those photos, those videos are incredibly powerful, because when you just hear words thrown around like, you know, trans woman, or even sometimes just woman used for someone who is biologically male who identifies as a woman, you kind of like, okay, well, you know, whatever, it's inclusive. And that's obviously the sort of the narrative the media sells. But when you actually see photos, as you say, of someone like Laurel Hubbard or someone like Leah Thomas up on the podium, they're towering over these women, it's very, very easy then to see that this is incredibly unfair.
Mm-hmm. And also you have the podium shots with the great big male on the top and the two women each side, and those women don't look happy, you know. And the other tragedy is that there was a woman who trained hard to be at the Olympics who was displaced by this male, and that's unfair. So all of that, I think, and the visual itself is very discouraging to our young women.
Yeah, it's like, why even try if you know that a man can basically come in and take your place in the first instance and then your award in the second? Like, it's going to put a lot of females off, like you say.
Mm-hmm.
And so with this coalition agreement, so they made the agreement, and then this week it sounds like, they're actually getting the ball rolling pretty quickly, which I was also really excited about, because the government was basically talking about how they are going to be withholding public funding from sporting bodies who don't provide safe and fair sport for women. And so, again, a really positive announcement. Unsurprisingly, the New Zealand media did not portray it that way at all. I've got a few headlines here that I might just read out. So the New Zealand Herald said transgender athletes to be banned from publicly funded women's sport under new government policy. The opinion section of the New Zealand Herald said, is the participation of transgender women really the biggest issue facing New Zealand sport? TV1, transgender athletes face exclusion from community sport. News Hub said New Zealand First threatens to withhold funding from sporting bodies if they don't ban or have policies around transgender athletes. The Spin-Off said, would you really care if a trans player scored against you on a social soccer team? And Stuff said that sports continue with transgender inclusion despite the coalition agreement. So that was pretty much the extent of the media coverage in New Zealand. And as far as I could tell, they didn't interview a single female athlete. They interviewed a male who identifies as a woman, but they didn't interview a single actual female athlete. So that's why I really thought it would be great to talk to someone like you, who is a prominent female Kiwi athlete, just to give you the opportunity to actually address some of the claims that were made in the media. Because as I said, it wasn't positive coverage. I'm sure you've seen it yourself. A lot of it was just incredibly negative. And actually, before we do address the coverage in a bit more detail, from what you've seen, what was your initial reaction?
Well, I read some of the interviews and listened to them the other day, and I just think, well, they're not there yet. The media hasn't caught up with the new program, so they will, because the funding speaks pretty loud. It reminds me, Rachel, of when New Zealand sport was funded, sponsored by the tobacco companies. And that was 1990, when Helen Clark supported a bill for deregulating the use of tobacco in sports, and funding sports for several years so they could get alternative sponsorship. And the tobacco companies lobbied. They had a lot of money, and but they lost. And it was the time of the Commonwealth Games, and I helped to recruit a bunch of medalists, and we met on the steps of Parliament, and they pledged their medals to Helen Clark's cause, because they felt that the combination of sport with tobacco was not a good match, and it did not give a positive message to our young people. And I can see a similarity now, that there is an agenda, obviously, and I don't know, this whole trans thing has come on with a rapid onslaught, but it's very different from when, in my day, when the women themselves were racing and increasing in numbers, and it was a real grassroots movement that forced the top to change their policies and include women. And so there was something, I think, that was very true and real, authentic. It was an idea that whose time had come. What I see is that the number of trans people, or the actual trans people speaking for trans people, are very, very small. I've only seen a couple that will get in a race and assert their right to be in a race, and will speak up and become mouthpieces. But there is not a whole grassroots movement. Maybe there's more and more trans people because there is all this young people, children, being recruited into this whole trans ideology from a very young age, which I think on itself is very dangerous and very destructive to the biology of a young person. And I just don't believe that there are the numbers that are supporting this. And I do believe that it is a top-down driven program for some purpose. And I don't want to get into, what people would call conspiracy theories and all the rest. But if there is power and money to be had, you can be sure there is somebody who has it covered and their finger on it and figure they're going to profit by pushing people in a certain direction. And
100%. I think there are a lot of forces at play with the gender ideology movement, with transgenderism, but money is, I would say, definitely one of them. I think there are a lot of things going on in the background, but there is a lot of money to be made for having patients for life who need ongoing hormones, all that kind of thing. So yeah, we won't go down that rabbit hole too far, but there's definitely a lot to be said in that area as well. And I'm also equally incredibly concerned about the medicalized gender affirmation of children. Anyway, that's probably another conversation. But in relation to this agreement and the media coverage of it, obviously no female athletes were interviewed. A male cyclist, a transgender woman, Kate Weatherly, was interviewed. How did you feel about the fact that this athlete was interviewed, but no females were interviewed by the media, by any of the New Zealand media, with this particular announcement?
Well, isn't it strange that now women are being represented by men? There's something just terribly wrong here. And our women athletes are quite capable of speaking for themselves. And yet the main stakeholders in this whole thing, their voice is not heard. So I see that as its own form of misogyny and the putting down of women once again. And, sport has been a wonderful way in which women have been able to express themselves in a male domain and develop their will and their power and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a very good thing. And what's going to happen? I don't know where it ends, but I think this government, you've got some good people who realise that this has to stop. It has to stop now because it's very quickly getting out of hand.
I think you're right. I think there are some good people in this government, and myself and others have been very encouraged by the commitments that they've made. I'm just wondering what's going to happen over the next few years with the media and whether or not they're actually going to be given a fair chance. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how that develops. I think you're right in what you said earlier, like the sporting bodies eventually will probably have to follow suit in relation to the funding. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the media platforms.
Yeah, I think the media, unless they're completely bought out, they will adjust. It's really interesting, but once a policy is made, then people just adapt. And we are very adaptable. We just need to ask, are we adapting in a way that is positive, that opens doors and opportunities for our people? It encourages life and fitness and health and all those good things. Or does it have a negative effect overall? The press, I think, has been a very captured press since the Labour government came in and this whole COVID thing, and then suddenly we saw all these new policies and people getting corralled into things that were subversive of the free will and the free speech that we have so much enjoyed and that we considered were fundamental to our democracy. And, sport is just an indicator, but it indicates of what's happening, and the health of our sport it's so much a part of the New Zealand psyche that when we're looking at what's happening here, we can see that it has a pretty big ripple effect throughout all the other stratas of society.
That's right. It's like a little microcosm of society, but in New Zealand's case, it's a very important, influential microcosm because it's just so important to Kiwis. So in relation to these different claims made by the media, because some of them they kind of went from, just negative and to quite outrageous, to be honest. But I thought we'd just kind of go through some of them bit by bit, because the reality is if you're a New Zealander and you're just tuning into the mainstream media, you're not going to get another perspective. You're just going to get what they're telling you unless you're doing your own research or tuning into alternative platforms. And so I thought it would be really good just to go through some of the key claims being made, kind of manage to categorize them a little bit, just to kind of get your thoughts so that people can have a more balanced perspective on this issue. So the first claim that was made across all the different media platforms that I looked at was that this particular policy is harmful. It's harmful to transgender people who they claim are particularly vulnerable, and specifically that it will exclude transgender people from sport, and that it is a really divisive and hardline and separatist policy. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that firstly.
I think we've covered this already, Rachel, that sport is inclusive. Just go in your own category. So you can identify with whatever you like. I think most people these days are very tolerant of anybody who has a different type of sexual expression. But I don't think your sexual expression has anything to do with sport. It's just conflating something that it doesn't need to be there. Just keep it simple. If you have male parts and you have the XY chromosome, you go in the male category. And if you have, female parts and you have XX chromosomes, and you go in that. And that's a pretty good system. It worked pretty well. While I was doing sport, we had a sex chromosome test. I even had I was a card-carrying female, had been verified as having the XX genes from a cheek scrape, and that got thrown out just fairly recently in sport, and they started to have another measure of how much testosterone you have. But, I think it doesn't really work, and that just measuring testosterone. Now, if a woman took testosterone, and even if she didn't get it above the level that a trans man or a biological man who claims he is trans would have competing in a women's sport, that woman would still be against the rules. Right? So it starts to get so darn messy when you do that. So, I can understand a man who is very ambitious, who is probably a middling athlete in the male division, but can be at the top of his sport in the female division. I can understand the incentive. I understand ambition. But it is fostering very poor sportsmanship and ethics in our young people. And we are institutionalizing it by saying it's okay for you to do that. And you're not being included in the group where you can win because, oh, poor you, if you have to go in the division that is consistent with the sex that you were born with, you won't win anymore. Boo-hoo. I have absolutely no sympathy for that argument at all.
That's right. And I think the other thing people fail to look at when they talk about this kind of policy being harmful or exclusive is they actually forget to look at what's happening with women and girls at the moment with the status quo, which is that as we discussed earlier, they're actually being excluded from their own category because males are taking their positions or they're taking their places on the podium. And not only that, but they're also potentially suffering harm if they are in a sport that is actually dangerous and they're coming up against males who they should never be coming up against in those kinds of events. And then there's also the issue, as we've seen discussed quite a lot in places like the US, there's been talk about it in Australia as well. I've had parents come to me where young girls and women are having to have biological males exposing themselves in their shared changing rooms. So there are a lot of harms that are also, taking place at the moment in relation to women and girls with the status quo, which is allowing, men to participate in women's sports. So I completely agree with you. Like, I don't think that the policy that has been introduced, which protects female sport, is harmful to people who identify as transgender because, as you say, they're not excluded from sport. They're just having to play in the same sex category as everyone else. But yeah, so much of the time, the media in particular just completely brushes over the fact that actually women and girls are being harmed by the status quo. So.
Well, Rachel, I remember when a man exposing himself to a woman or a girl was an illegal act, and they would be put in prison for it. So, how do we go from that and protecting our girls, which, look, I know when my body was changing how incredibly sensitive I was about that. And, it's a tough time. And I cannot imagine then having to share a change room with a man. I'd find that just mortifying, when I remember back to my age, and I don't think that girls have changed that much, or to me, that's just straight out sexual abuse.
Yeah. Yeah, and no, they haven't changed at all. And I think, and even outside the sporting issue, I mean, I have parents contacting me not infrequently about their young daughters who are, in mixed schools and who are terrified to go to the bathroom because it's completely allowable for boys who identify as girls to join them in there. So there are girls who will literally hold on to go to the toilet all day because they don't want to share bathrooms with boys. This is happening in Australia at the moment. So yeah, obviously this issue has ramifications far beyond sport, but just on that bathroom change room issue, it's a much, much broader issue, and it's really, really, really concerning.
So, who is going to speak up for our young women? Really, and it has to be the parents, but it needs to be part of how we conduct our society to make sure that all members are taken care of. And you're talking how many transgender people. Well, it's such a maybe 0.05%. I'm sure it's increasing, but you're talking about 50% of the population approximately of girls and women. And so their needs, and just in terms of proportion, is much larger and needs to be taken care of than just this catering to this very small percentage of people.
Exactly. And just on the community sport issue in particular, because as I said earlier, that's something that this policy is actually quite unique in, that it actually is going to impact community sport, whereas a lot of the other things that have been happening worldwide on this issue have been more focused on elite sport. We've sort of talked a lot about inclusion, but there was one particular article, I think it was the spin-off article, which it was a very difficult piece to read, but the comment that was made was basically like, oh, this is community sport, like it's for the community, like who really cares, who joins in? Would you really care if a transgender woman, i.e. a biological male, scored against you in a game of, social soccer? Like, what's the big deal? And I just found that quite offensive, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's like saying if I only steal a little bit, then it doesn't really matter. The thing is, there is a very strong moral issue here. And And that's why we have rules and policies, so that we keep everything straight and everybody knows what's going on, and then everybody just adjusts to it accordingly. And I just think that argument is it's pathetic. Really, I don't think it's good journalism at all. I wouldn't even bother reading it.
And I mean, like we discussed before when we were talking, if women and girls don't even get a fair chance at the community level at the outset, then how are they going to progress to elite sports if they're just excluded from the very beginning because there are males taking their place? So, you know, people can kind of talk about it and make light of it and, oh, it's just a friendly community sporting thing. But, you know, if they're not even getting a shot there, or, you know, they're starting to exclude themselves because they don't want to go up against biological males, they don't want to share the change rooms with them, whatever it is, then it's going to be very, very difficult for them to then progress to having any kind of sporting career. So,
well, I also think that it is, in some ways, you are telling women that the way they feel is wrong, and that their natural instinct of modesty, of wanting to be protected, of feeling insecure in that energy, you're saying that's wrong. You shouldn't feel that way. So you just have to lump it, you know. It's very cruel.
It's just insane. Those natural instincts are there for a reason, and the degree to which we're constantly being told now that actually, you know, you need to rewire, you need to retrain your brain, was actually a phrase used recently in Australia. I think it was actually by Surf Lifesaving, who now have a policy around transgender. Well, no, they had a draft fact sheet around trans inclusion, and they were talking about pronouns and things like that, and the phrase was, oh no, you've got to retrain your brain. And it's like, well, actually, things sit the way they do for a reason usually. And, you know, when it comes to women and men and sharing intimate spaces or competing against each other in physical activities, there's a reason why you naturally don't want to do that as a woman.
Well, look, Rachel, that's so true. And that, what about trans people who wish to present themselves as the other sex than what they were born as? Why don't they retrain their brain so that they can present themselves in the category and, you know, do their sport? Because that to me is a much easier solution.
Yeah.
Why do we have to worry about your comfort level? You know, you've made your choices, now live with them. Why should women bear the brunt of your choice? So, you know,
that's a good point.
Yeah, retrain your brain, guys.
Yeah.
You know?
Maybe we'll just start using that one. Okay, so some of the other sort of claims in the media were very, very bad arguments, I have to say, for the status quo. So there are a few in particular that I found, which I thought would be worth discussing. And the first one was that, I think it was in the New Zealand Herald, and it was that, by the transgender athlete, Kate Weatherly, that sports are inherently unfair. You know, they're dependent on money, where you're born, your coaches. And so basically that's the way it is. Sport is inherently unfair.
Well, I don't even know what to say. You know, so I don't think we're in life to balance out everybody's circumstances. I think our circumstances are tailor-made for us for our particular journey on this earth. And we all develop in our own unique way according to the circumstances that we're given. And I don't think it's what you are presented with. My mother always used to say this: it's not what happens to you that matters, it's what you do with it that matters. And so I don't see that as a valid argument at all. It doesn't even sort of make sense to me.
No, I agree. And I think most sane people would understand that fairness is literally the bedrock of sport. Like, it's one of the main things. So to say that sport is inherently unfair, it's honestly quite nonsensical. The other claim that was made
And,
was that,
you know, Rachel, can I just add to that?
yes,
Because it was not in my rise to sport, it was nothing to do. It wasn't because I had rich parents, which I didn't, or that I had circumstances that gave me an advantage over others. Though I do think that growing up in New Zealand was one of those great advantages that I had, a great training system. And I think parents that encouraged us to go for what we loved and to go do it, and yet in all of that, there was also a great sense of moral responsibility that we were given. And, you know, I said that before about this idea of sportsmanship and how you behave and on and off in the field and towards other people. And, you know, one of the worst things you could ever do would be to be a bad sport. That was like a horrible, horrible thing. You know, I would rather lose than be a bad sport. So, you know, we need to bring back those things, those qualities that are noble. And sport was a noble pursuit. It was for us to embody the virtues and to seek our own personal excellence. You know, we have countless examples of people who, despite what might be seemingly disadvantages, who triumph in the most extraordinary ways. And that opportunity for the individual to do that is there. So we don't have to, you know, because somebody feels one way that will suddenly we have to cater to them and create a whole category around them. That's just childish, and it's pandering to something that is not noble at all in its pursuit.
Yep, I think we definitely need to bring back that idea of nobility in sport and all those kinds of values that you're talking about. They've definitely been lost along the way somewhere, sadly.
Yeah.
One of the other claims, or one of the other defenses of the status quo, was that, oh, well, you know, there are more important issues facing women's sport and these should be dealt with first.
Like what?
So I think
more important issues.
So things like they were talking about, this is across all the different media outlets, talking about things like sexual assault, which is sort of has been rampant in certain sporting areas, imbalance with things like funding, lack of support, toxic cultures, things like that.
Yeah, well, I think all those things need to be dealt with. It's not a matter of something is insignificant. I don't think this whole trans thing, I think it has considerable weight and does need to be catered to, because otherwise we go back to the time where women are excluded. And then it's just full circle. And then I go, okay, well, what was I doing out there? You know, what did it count for if suddenly somebody can just come along and, you know, wipe that? And now you're excluded once again. So, you know, that inclusion is actually inclusion for men in women's sports is exclusion for women in women's sports. And that's the bottom line.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if we don't deal with this particular issue in relation to the gender stuff, then I mean, what does it matter for these issues? Because eventually women are just going to be completely excluded. I mean, this is sort of along a similar vein. There was another comment basically about how, oh, well, we already know sports can be dangerous, but no one's really doing anything about it. So, you know, why bother now? But it's the same, it's basically the same thing. It's like, just because there are other things that need to be addressed doesn't mean that this isn't important. Those things are also important. Let's address all of them. But saying that there are other things doesn't negate the importance of this particular issue. So we don't even need to talk about that because it's it's just very obvious. Another claim that came out was that, this isn't a real problem. A news hub apparently asked New Zealand First about examples of sports that they had concerns about, and apparently New Zealand First wasn't be able to give like a specific example. And so I was wondering if there are any examples that you knew of in New Zealand where this obviously we've talked about more broadly, and clearly there are male athletes competing in women's sports, taking women's positions and taking their places. Do you know of any particular instances in New Zealand where this is happening, apart from Laurel Hubbard?
No, yeah, apart from the obvious ones, which everyone knows of, Rachel, but I'm not in touch with the New Zealand sporting scene at that level. So, but I tell you, I wouldn't want to even go watch a race when a woman's race when men are in it. I just would not, it would not have interest for me. I can remember watching the men's distance running at the 84 Olympics, and it became obvious that there was a group of people break away that were blood doped. And I just lost interest in watching it because I went, I'm not even going to give these people my attention because I know that they're cheating. Yeah. And it did turn out that the winner of that race turned a positive drug test and was banned. But I absolutely abhor cheating and people who seek to get an advantage over others. And, the drug of choice in my time was testosterone. So you took steroids because it enhanced your performance. And it meant that, you could train harder and get performances that you couldn't get on your own. And so what you've got now is people who have natural testosterone competing against people who don't. And even with the testosterone suppression, they're still at the upper level. And the thing is that once they've gone through puberty, they have advantages over women, just like Peter Snell's on that curve and I'm on that curve, that you retain those. You have the bigger structure, you have all those neural pathways that are laid down that give them a physical advantage. That is why the top men are consistently head and shoulders above the top women. And you put them all in a race or in an event together, anything that has strength and speed, and the men are going to win. So those ones, we do need to have separate categories. Now, I think if they're playing tiddlywinks, or people probably don't know what tiddlywinks is anymore, but, drafts or checkers or something like that, well, it's fine to have a mixed category. But, that science, and you're probably going to come up with this one saying the science is not clear, which is an absolute untruth. The science is very, very clear. So that men have an advantage over women, and you only have to look at the records across the board to see that in the running events, the men, and this is ultras, it levels out somewhat. Women have a capacity to seem to have to match the men or even surpass them when it is just purely endurance. But when it is any strength or speed factor, that the testosterone helps men considerably, and there will be a 10% differential between the top men and the top women. Now, so if you look at, say, a strength sport like the shot put, and you have Valerie Adams. Now, if she had to compete against men, we wouldn't have a Valerie Adams as an Olympic champion. She wouldn't have stand a show. The woman's shot put is already about 2/3 the weight of a men's shot put. Why? Because women are not as strong as men. So so there has been over this whole modern period a recognition of that biological difference, and it has been built into the system of sport, and it is part of the way that sport is thought of and run, and it's there for a very good reason. It's tried and true. So I think a lot of these people that are talking about, oh, there's the sciences, whatever, and the testosterone levels, and there's overlaps and all this sort of stuff, they don't have that history, and they don't understand that they're just throwing something out there that under scrutiny does not hold up at all.
That's right. And I think it's what's quite interesting is, and this is basically what you're saying, is that until relatively recently, we didn't actually need to do studies about how, men and women perform differently in sports, and that men are stronger and faster and etc. Because it was just so obvious to people. And as you said earlier, this is, why we had why we've had separate male and female sporting categories for such a long time. And then more recently, because of the transgender issue, there's kind of been all these studies coming out, and they're basically proving exactly what we've already known for forever, which is that there are biological sex differences between men and women. I mean, there was one that literally just got announced yesterday in the media, and it was about runners, and it was basically concluding that sex is a better predictor of sports performance than gender identity, surprise, surprise, and that the sex gap still holds true between males and females, even if they're non-binary. And so the fact that we even need to do this research is quite frankly insane, but the research is being done, and it is showing what we already know, that there are biological sex differences between men and women that matter in sport. So
right. And so we come back to, so what does your identity have to do with sport? Why should we change everything around because you have a feeling about something that for you is obviously very significant and, is great, but why would we change the whole structure of sport to accommodate that? I don't get it at all. I mean, I couldn't care if somebody is, I mean, they can identify with whatever they like, but it doesn't change the facts. And we're starting to sort of get loose on the facts, and starting to throw in things that are not facts. And honestly, it's crazy making stuff. And I just shake my head. Okay, whatever. Yeah.
And just thinking back to that point about the specific examples about the New Zealand first not being able to give any, and I would have thought that Kate Weatherly would have been an obvious example to give, who had been interviewed by all these mainstream media outlets, and who, my understanding is, has won cycling competitions in New Zealand. So that's an example where a biological male has been competing in a women's competition and has been taking a woman's place and has been taking a women's award. So aside from Laurel Hubbard, I would have thought Kate would have been an example. I was also going to say on that though, and you may agree, that even if we don't know of every single example, there are a lot of women and girls who are too afraid to speak up, whether it be at the community or the elite level, because of the backlash that they are going to get. So there are a lot of examples that I've heard about, for example, in Australia, where parents have contacted me or women have contacted me and said that this is happening in their particular sport, where biological males are getting involved and taking the places and taking the awards, but people are scared. And so we already know there are examples out there. There are examples from New Zealand, there are examples from Australia, there are examples internationally, but then there are also all the examples that we never even get to hear about because there's just this fear surrounding this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing, is that girls have a much more natural inclination to be inclusive and to be accepting. I don't think if it was the men, that they're much more likely to speak up if they see something that isn't right, or they have their own physical strength that they can rely on. That's why men fight, and physically, So it's not a good deal for our young women, and I would hate to see that all this talk about inclusion and having young women give up sport because they don't want to change in a change room with a man. I saw a recent case in England where a 50-year-old man was competing with the girls in swimming. And, it's just like, why?
Yeah.
And some of the girls were like 10 years old.
Oh gosh, I haven't even heard about that one. There are just so many. And on that, yeah, the point you made about our natural dispositions and inclinations was a really good one. And I actually think to a certain degree, they've been really weaponized against us in relation to this particular issue, in relation to, I think, gender stuff more broadly as well. But our desire to be kind of, inclusive and kind and accepting has just really, been used against us and to our detriment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was at the swimming pool this summer, and in the women's change rooms, and there was a mother with her 10-year-old daughter, and the daughter was standing on the wooden slats and getting changed from her swimsuit into her clothes, and the mother was holding the towel up. And, I just thought, oh gosh, like this mother was being very careful to make sure that the daughter had her privacy just within the woman.
Yeah.
So she could take her bathing suit off and put her clothes on. And I found it very, very touching, and I went, oh gosh, now if you had a girl like that, she's going to be terrified if a man comes in. It's those policies are very insensitive, and I think the people who push these policies have something to gain for themselves from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kate Weatherly is probably having a heyday, getting things that she or he would never get in the ordinary course of competition. And I can understand standing up there and, sounding off, because I'm sure he doesn't want that taken away from him.
Yeah, but there's just not a care given for the women whose places that he's taken, which is just, yeah. So,
no, I just think it's very, very selfish.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So you're over in the US at the moment, and I think they're doing better than the Kiwis and the Aussies are on this. How are you finding things over there with this issue?
Well, there's been a lot more pushback in the US, and fortunately we have, the group Icons, which had a conference in Denver, which I was a part of, and just seeing the woman who was speaking out, like the young woman, which was really wonderful, and spearheaded by Riley Gaines, who doesn't mince any words. She's
amazing.
quite wonderful, the way that she just goes for it. But a woman who feel very passionate about the preserving women's sports and protecting women's sports and women's spaces. So I think this battle will be won, because we've come too far, I think, especially in New Zealand. I think, like you said, first country to get the vote. We've got very, I think at grassroots, that's still that good pioneering and self-sufficient type of person that I think has made New Zealand. I think that is still alive and well, and it will come to the fore. I think often with these types of things, they are policies that are probably in the planning for a long time, and they are put upon us very quickly, and it takes a while for us en masse to wake up to it. You just suddenly go like, what the heck's going on, And but very gradually people come to an understanding of this, and then they start getting the pushback. And I think that's happened now. I think that pushback came with the vote of this new government.
Yeah.
And it started. And I think that you're going to see these athletes who have eroded the woman's rights and places are going to be back where they belong fairly soon. So and all it takes and what is necessary is good leadership. So yeah,
right.
I think it will die a natural death.
I think that's right. I think reality is catching up.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like you say, it's also important for there to be good leaders out there who are actually pushing for the right kind of change as well. Otherwise, I think it would be very easy for it just to continue on a lot longer than it really should. But I can definitely feel the pushback as well, both in New Zealand and Australia. There's been a huge shift over the last few years on these issues. I mean, there's still, I think, a long way to go, and we're definitely behind the US, we're definitely behind the UK. But even just the number of people standing up and saying things about this and sort of critiquing what's going on has changed significantly over the last few years. Whereas beforehand, there was hardly any media coverage, hardly anyone willing to put their head above the parapet. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of encouraging movement in this space.
I think too that it takes a while, but if you got the women themselves, the ones who are competing, standing up for themselves, I think it would only take a few times where you said, there's a man there, we're not competing. If they just did that, it would change everything incredibly fast.
I agree. I mean, things could literally change overnight if that's what happened in every sport. I think probably a bit easier said than done, but I agree with you. If the woman just said, nah, we're not taking this anymore, it would make a huge difference. And I think...
I know, yeah. It happened in surfing, didn't it? The top woman surfer said, if I have to compete against men, I'm not competing.
Yeah. And and on that note, I was going to say, if even at the outset, the top female athletes in those different sports stood up, because I mean, they're the ones who maybe they're a bit safer, they've got a bit more clout, then again, it would just allow everyone else to be able to kind of rise up and be able to stand up for themselves as well. So I think it's really important for those more prominent female athletes, particularly ones who, like yourself, and you're doing an incredible job. And I know that I'm so grateful, and so many women are so grateful for your voice, because at the end of the day, I mean, you don't have any skin in the game as such because you're not having to compete, but you're standing up for all the current and future women and girls who are playing sports. And so I think if other female athletes did that, other ones who, weren't necessarily competing anymore, or ones who were competing but maybe had, a more kind of prominent, safer kind of role in the sporting world, then I think that would just make a huge impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I saw a video about, it was in Brazil, and, the Brazilian women are pretty feisty, and it was in a gym, and a man came in to the gym, into the women's section, and these women, they just, they went for him, and they dragged him out onto the street, and they weren't having a bar of it, and that was it. They stood up for themselves, and maybe this is what is called for women to stand up for themselves, and that they need to take a stand for their own sex and category. And I also think that the men should be standing up for their women also.
Yeah, completely agree.
Yeah. And when I was competing, the men were wonderful. They ran with me. They would wait up for me if they needed to. They always made sure I got home safely all those kinds of things. And I really, really appreciated that because it got me on the right course. And I think that's the natural order of things, that men should take a protective role towards their women and make sure that they are always safe, and particularly their girls. Any father would, I think, you only have to talk to parents, and so many of them, if they haven't completely bought this very woke agenda, hook, line and sinker, but most parents, we certainly want the best for our children, and we want them to be safe and protected. And that is the duty that we have as parents, and also a duty that we have to each other as human beings. So it's not about, fairness is not about somebody scooping all the goodies or winning. And sport is not about winning. If we just focus on that, then we're lost. We've lost the plot. It's much, much bigger than that. It's a really fantastic path for people to take, and to learn how to use their energies and to manifest the dreams that they have for themselves. And that is a fantastic skill that anybody who partakes in it, no matter what they achieve, can master their own self. And that's what it's about.
Absolutely. And I love what you've just said about men, because I think in our current culture, it's sort of not unusual for men to sort of be told, oh, you don't have a voice in this isn't about you, or this isn't your issue, no matter what it is, really. And so I think to sort of almost in some respects give them that permission, actually, we need your voice on this as well, and we would like your help. And I know a lot of great men who are already speaking out on this anyway, but I'm sure there are some who think, oh, maybe it's not my place. So I think it's really great that you've sort of made that point, that actually, we need you to help us in this fight, in this sort of battle for fairness and safety for women and girls. And I know that the dads in particular are already, quite invigorated, because I've spoken to a lot of them about this issue, but just kind of, just the average guy who loves sport, who enjoys sport, who cares about women and girls. I think it's really important for them to have a voice on this as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, wouldn't it be great if you had a race and all the men decided to go in the women's event?
Well, exactly. I know, just to make a point, right?
Just to make a point. Yeah. And it just messes up their whole system. They'd be adjusting to that as quick as anything.
Yeah.
The power of the individual is really it is far-reaching, but collectively, you just band together with a few others. That is so powerful, and changes can be made incredibly well. I was part of the movement in 1981 that was to bring professionalism into the sport. So a whole group of runners ran. There was a purse put up, and they all ran and took the money. And because they did it en masse, it just blew apart this whole amateur code, which was basically an athlete feudal system. And the whole system changed. So, prior to that, you couldn't take any money. You couldn't get sponsorship. It all had to go to somebody else, that it was it was just a system of control, because there was plenty of money in the sport, but it didn't go to the athletes. The athletes were like the slave labor, and wow. There'd be all these people flying first class, going all over the world, having these big meetings and et cetera, and then the athletes would be threatened with being exiled from the sport if they took any money.
Wow.
Because it was against the rules. But that changed overnight when the athletes got together and decided, okay, we've had enough of this.
That's amazing. We need one of those moments.
Yes, and I think we're ready for one. And I can tell you, Rachel, that in my the achievements that I got, that rates as one of the highest.
Wow.
because I was part of that movement, you know,
Yeah.
and I stood for what I believed was right. And, you know, at the expense of being banned for life from the sport that I absolutely loved. But because I went with what I believed in my heart was the right thing to do, despite any cost to my own career, it paid off huge dividends. And it also, I realized that there was a solidarity amongst athletes because they said it would never happen because athletes, they could not in an individual sport band together to make a difference. But they did, you know, and I felt a tremendous love and camaraderie with the people that stood with me. It was incredible time. And so I think about that, and it seems to me like that there's these events, life moves along in a rhythm and cycles, and the next thing comes where people are called to be courageous and have the courage of their convictions and to do what they see as right for the common good. And this is probably one of those times coming around again for those people that are involved in it. And so, you know, that's what winning is in my book. Yeah.
And I hope you're right, and I think you might be. Should probably let you get back to Christmas. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we sort of part ways? Is there any other kinds of points you'd like to make or things you'd like to bring up?
I think we've covered that. Rachel, one thing that I would like it to be that we encourage this pride in being a woman, that we don't allow people to erode that or diminish us as women, as those with estrogen and ovaries and, you know, all that that goes, that is precious to being a woman. I don't think there needs to be a battle amongst the sexes, but I do think we need to tell our girls how precious it is to be a woman, how precious it is to be carrying your genetic library, and that is such a valuable thing and a gift. For myself, I think, you know, as a career athlete, I was in a male world for a very long time, but to become a mother was such a gift to me. And I did that, you know, fairly late in life, post-career at the age of 45. But what a powerful initiation that was for me to not try to control circumstances, but just really basically to have your heart broken open like that. It was a phenomenal thing. And I don't think we often tell our girls that the things that make us essentially female is a real gift to us, and that we should treasure it and not think that there is something deficient or wrong with us because we're not as strong as men or as vocal or as tough. That we all have our place here, and I think every human being is a precious gift that we need to treasure. And so it is really important, I think, that women speak up for each other and that we find a common ground again, rather than these things that are divisive or divisive in a very insidious way. And so, yeah, I think I've said enough.
I think that was a really
waxing all
I think that was a really
philosophical now, but
No,
yeah.
I love it. I think that was a really, really beautiful note to end on about us really sort of emphasizing the value of women and womanhood and kind of passing that on to younger generations as well, because I think, it has been lost a lot. And there is this kind of idea in our culture that women need to be like men to kind of, get along and to be successful and all of that. And a lot of, I guess those kind of inherent female qualities are often sort of suppressed because they're not going to get you anywhere, basically. And so I think it's celebrating womanhood and celebrating women is really, really important. So thank you for that little bit of philosophy at the end. I loved it. And thank you so, so much for coming to chat with me and for all you're doing for women's sport and for, all you've done, all you continue to do, because it's just, it's phenomenal. And it's wonderful for young women to have a role model such as yourself speaking out on these issues. And so thank you so much, Lorraine.
Well, Rachel, here's looking back at you and all that you do for sport and your voice and your tireless campaigning on behalf of women. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this interview, and thank you so much. We need a lot more like you, Rachel.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.